Drawing a birds of paradise like this is easier than you might think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it.
Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the weekly videos and so that you can join our wonderful creative community. And with that said, grab your drawing tools and let's get started.
Just a little heads up before we start, this video is a little bit more advanced than my regular tutorials because I'm going over some of the techniques just a little bit quicker. So if you're new to my watercolor videos, I highly recommend you check out another one of my plant watercolor videos first and then come back to this one just to kind of get a feel for the technique. And I'm gonna link a bunch of them in the description below so you can just pick your favorite. So in this video, I'm going to be drawing in an app called Procreate, which is on the iPad, and we're all going to start by creating a new canvas. For reference, these are the dimensions of the canvas that I am using, but make sure that you create a canvas that works for your own project requirements. And if you're not exactly sure what that means, I have a video in which I'm going to teach you everything you need to know in order to pick a canvas size. So that will be linked in the description below as well as in the annotations. And the only reason I am using these sizes is because I'm using a pre-textured file that has some sort of a watercolor paper texture to it. So that's really the only reason. And don't worry, this file is not essential. If you don't have it, you can still follow along. I'm going to give you tips later on how to still have some sort of a watercolor feel. And the first thing we're going to do is to create a new layer and rename it to Sketch. And we're going to pick whichever color we want, honestly, for the sketch. I'm going to go with gray, but we're not going to see the sketch in the final result anyway, so it doesn't matter that much. And in terms of brushes, in this video, I'm always going to be suggesting two brushes. One is going to be a free brush that comes with Procreate, and that can definitely allow you to follow along. And the other brush is going to be a brush from my big brush bundle, which will also be linked in the description below with a special promo code for the YouTube people. And these brushes can not only get you more professional results, but it can really help you save some time. So if you want to check them out, there will be linked in the description below again, but you can still follow along with some basic Procreate brushes. And for the sketches, the sketch, again, we're not going to see it in the final result, so the brush really doesn't matter. I recommend you use either the A3 pencil from the sketching panel or the coloring pencil from the watercolor brushes. And we're going to start simply by mapping out where everything is going to be with a very simple, rough sketch. So you can have whatever you want, wherever you want. I like to have a pretty big leaf in the back, so I'm just going to sketch that, just a leaf shape. And I'm going to pretend that my leaf is kind of folded, so I'm just going to kind of add a second section on top of it. And here I really encourage you to experiment with the composition so you get an illustration that is yours and not just exactly what I'm doing. For the flower itself, you're going to start by drawing kind of this like L shape, and then you're going to thicken it. So it's going to look like a boomerang, just like this. And you want to make sure that the lower part of it is flat and then the top is slightly more curved. And then you can add little lines on which you're going to have kind of the blue parts of the flower. So the blue parts of the flower are going to be pretty similar to the bottom part, but just smaller and blue. So you can kind of sketch the same kind of shape. And then you're going to have some yellow, orange little, they look like petals, honestly. So you can kind of draw little pointy, thin petals pretty much wherever you want. I like to have both the blue and the yellow petals as groups of either like 3 or 5. So I'm having here 3 blue ones and 5 orange and yellow ones. It just is a rule for composition in general. Unless you're going for symmetry, it is better to have odd numbers of items. So 3, 5, 7, 9, you get the idea. And this video is a really good example of having to trust the process because we're going to add the colors and it's going to start looking really messy and honestly quite ugly for a while, and then I'm going to bring everything together and then it's going to magically look really good. So if you think your piece looks strange, that is fine. Just stick with it, and I promise that by the end you're going to be much more happy with the result that you've been probably in the middle of this video. So anyway, with that said, we're going to start by adding some colors, and to do that, I personally like to lower the opacity of my sketch until I can kind of just barely see it, just so that it doesn't get too much in the way. Once that is done, go ahead and create a new layer and make sure it is below the sketch layer, and we're going to rename this one to flower base or base flower, whatever you want, and we're gonna draw on this part, kind of the multicolor part of the flower. So we're gonna draw 3 parts to the flower and then 1 part to the leaf. We're gonna separate them because later in the process you're gonna see it's gonna be really helpful in order to change the colors and give some watercolor effects to have everything on separate layers. But for now, just go ahead and pick a pretty vibrant green, like a green apple green. And in terms of brushes, you can either use the hard brush from the airbrushing panel and lower the opacity. That way you're gonna get some of that overlapping effect when you draw, which is gonna be super helpful in creating watercolor effects later. You're not gonna get any of the texture, of course, but that is okay. I'm gonna give you tricks later, like I was saying, to kind of mimic that by yourself. If you have the watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the dark edges watercolor. And the goal here is just going to be to fill in this bottom part of the flower, I guess, without lifting the pencil. Because since we have kind of transparency in the brush, no matter which brush you're using, you have transparency. Whenever we lift the pencil, it kind of resets the brush and it creates this overlapping effect that is going to be so helpful later. But for now, we want to kind of avoid it. So go ahead and draw kind of the main part of the flower without lifting the pencil, and then you can kind of add a little leaf on the side with lifting the pencil, if that made sense, hopefully. Once that is done, you can create a new layer and rename it to Flower Yellow. This one is going to be above the flower base. And for this, you're going to pick, I'm sure you can guess it, a yellow color. I personally like to go in the Harmony tool here on the bottom of the color panel and set the Harmony to analogous and then pick the yellow that I get recommended. And going back in the classic, I'm just going to make it probably more vibrant and a little bit, yeah, just more vibrant. And here, same thing as for the base, every little element, so every kind of yellow petal thing you want to draw without lifting the pencil. You can lift the pencil between each of them, of course, but for each one, try to just draw them in one continuous motion. If you can't, not a big deal. You're gonna get the overlap and we're gonna fix that later anyway. We're gonna blend everything, so don't worry too much about it, but try if it's possible. And once you have your yellow elements, just go ahead and create a new layer above that and rename it to Flower Blue. So you can probably guess where I'm going with that. You're going to go ahead and select a blue. And since we have a yellow, if we go to the Harmony panel, we're able to select Complementary, because this is going to be the color that is across yellow in the color wheel, and we can pick that blue. And basically using the Harmony tool, what it allows us to do is just we make sure that all the colors that we're picking are going to work well in the color palette. They're going to be, a nice coherent color palette. And with that blue, you can tweak it back in the classic option of the color panel, and then you can just go ahead and kind of color your little shapes, something like this. And don't worry if it overlaps with the yellow shapes, we're going to fix that really soon. Great, so now we have the basic color for the flowers laid down. It looks really strange, that is fine. We need to also do the same for the leaf. So below all the flower layers, go ahead and create a new layer and rename it to Leaf. And at this point, you can go back in your history and pick the same green, or you can change it. I'm personally gonna make mine a little bit darker and a little bit more blue. And here you can probably guess it, you're just going to try to map out the leaf without lifting your pencil for each section. So I'm doing mine kind of in 2 sections, the folded section here at the top and then the section in the back. But again, if you do lift your pencil, not big of a deal, because later in the process, we're going to blend everything in. And it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and comment Strelitzia, which is the real botanical name of the bird of paradise. And this secret password thing, I mean, we've been doing this for months now, and not only do you guys seem to really enjoy it, which is awesome, but it also gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which helps me create better tutorials for you guys. But I think the coolest thing about it is that it allows me to see the really great creative community that we're building here on this channel, because you guys kind of know me, but I don't know you at all. So whenever you leave a comment, I get to see your name, sometimes even your face, and it's just great to see the community that is growing here. So just go ahead and comment Strelitzia, and then we're gonna keep going. So at this point, we have kind of the main colors mapped out, but it looks really, really weird. So we're going to go in and kind of clean this up a little bit. And I personally like to just hide the leaf layer for now, just so we can see the flower better and just focus on that. So what we're going to do is we're going to create masks. And if you're not familiar with masks, that is fine. I have a video in which I teach you everything you need to know about all the types of masks. I will link it in the description below if you want to check it out. But for now, you can just double tap on your flower blue layer to open the layer option and select mask right here. So with the mask selected, you're going to pick the eraser. You can set it to whatever you want, just like a hard brush is going to work really well. And you're going to just erase the blue sections whenever you want the yellow petal. I'm going to call it petal for the rest of the tutorial instead of wondering every time. You're going to erase the blue section whenever you want the yellow petals to be in front. And you can see here, if we hide the mask, we didn't really erase the blue, so it is still there, but it's kind of hidden with the mask. Again, I'm not going to get into too many details about mask, but this is a really neat little trick. And you're going to do the same thing on the flower yellow layer, so just creating a mask, but this time you're going to erase whenever you want the blue to be in front. So that is just helping us kind of getting rid of this muddy color because of the overlay and transparency that we have. And also later when we start actually building the colors, these masks are going to help us protect the shape. And we're going to activate the leaf layer again, and we're going to do a little trick here. So hold 2 fingers on the flower base, which is going to select the color that we have on the flower base. Now, if we go and create a mask on the leaf layer and tap on this mask and then invert it, we can see that it automatically kind of erased the flower base on the leaf layer. We're going to do the same thing, so holding 2 fingers on the flower yellow and selecting the layer mask, we're going to be able to kind of use the eraser to very quickly just kind of brush over the area, and it's only going to erase what is in the selection, which in this case is the flower yellow layer content. Hopefully that makes sense, but that is a really simple, neat trick doing kind of the selection with 2 fingers. It kind of selects everything that, well, not kind of, it selects everything that is on that layer. So you can use that for mask. It is a really, again, a quick little tip. And we're going to do the same thing, you probably guessed it, with the flower blue. So selecting the flower blue content with 2 fingers, then going back on your leaf layer mask. Make sure you are on the mask and not on the leaf layer itself. And then you can just brush over with your eraser to erase the content of your selection, which is going to just make your blue less muddy. And at this point, we have all of our base colored mapped out. And as you can see, I was not lying to you earlier when I was telling you that it's going to look kind of not super good at one point in the video. This point, it looks bad, I know, but it is fine. We're going to move on to adding the watercolor effects, and it should start looking better pretty soon. Okay, so at this point, we're going to layer the colors to kind of create this watercolor effect that I've been telling you about. And go ahead and hide the leaf for that, is going to make everything easier. And select the flower base layer. Now, we can stick with the same green we've had for the base, so just going back in your history, or picking any other green, honestly, it doesn't matter that much. And you can pick this time either the medium brush from the hairbrushing panel or the medium hard brush and lower the opacity again, somewhere around 40-50% is good. If you have the watercolor brushes though, go ahead and pick the basic watercolor. And here we're just going to be, like I was saying, layering the colors so that we can get some of this watercolor feel. So we're going to basically create shadows and just color variation by going over certain spots multiple times. And that way you both want to create shadows, but also just random color variation. So this is how we're going to build, like I was saying, the watercolor effect. And you can do that with the same color you use for the base, and you can also kind of do it with a slightly different color you use for the base. So here I just went with a darker, more bluish green. And here, really, don't worry if it looks weird. We're going to blend everything later. We just kind of want, like I was saying, to add some color variation, so kind of blobby shapes. And we're going to do the same thing on the flower yellow and the flower blue layers as well. So picking this time either the same yellow or a slightly different one and just going over and kind of shading the petals that are behind. So kind of further away in the picture, we want to make sure that they're darker to kind of help separate them from the other ones. And also just adding some more random splotch and blobs that we're going to blend in later to create this watercolor effect that I keep telling you about. And so especially if you don't have the watercolor brushes, this step is really important. You want to go ahead and purposefully try to add some randomness with random blobs of randomly different shades of your main color in your different shapes. And as you can see here, like I mentioned earlier, we're also going to do the same thing on the blue section of the flower. Make sure that you change your layer when you do that, otherwise we're gonna have some issues later. So yeah, just random blobs, random sections, and just kind of put emphasis on the shadow parts, but also just create some randomness as well. And we're going to use the same technique on the leaf in the back. It's really important, we can't forget it. But before that, we are going to group all of our flower layers by swapping them towards the right and then clicking the group option here at the top. We're then going to be able to collapse the group and just rename it to flower. And then we can just use the hide and show function for the entire group instead of all the individual layers, and we can just that way hide all of the flower and show the leaf so that it is, again, just easier to kind of see what we're doing. And again, just same technique here. You can pick either the same green that you had at first or pick a slightly different one or both and you're just going to kind of shade in part of your leaf and also just add some randomness. So for example here, since my leaf is folded in two, I'm just shading one of the half, the one that is in the back, and then pretty much, you know, calling it a day, honestly. But yeah, again, if you don't have the watercolor brushes, it's really important that you take your time on this step and pretty much go in with at least 2 or 3 versions of your color to really add some randomness and color variation that you would not get with the basic brushes, but that you do get with the watercolor brushes. And at this point, we're going to start blending everything in so that we don't have this weird digital look to it and it looks more like watercolor. So for that, you can use either the smudge tool and set it to the soft brush, or if you have the watercolor brushes, you can set your paintbrush, so not the smudge tool, the actual paintbrush, to the water blender. And basically, the water blender or the smudge tool, think of it as like if you're, really painting with watercolor, think of it as adding some water to your paint. It is just going to blend in your pigments. So here you want to do that whenever you have weird kind of overlapping brush strokes within the shape, but you want to make sure that you keep the edges of your shape fairly sharp. So we don't want to just make it look like we're painting and the paint is bleeding in the paper. We want to make sure that the paint itself, like the edges are crisp and the shape is really nice and clear, but that everything that is inside the shape looks natural and looks like real watercolor, not like weird digital strokes. So go over and do that over all of your leaf, and when you're done, we're going to pretty much do the exact same thing on the different flower parts. So for that, you can choose to either keep your leaf shown or hide it again and activate the flower. Honestly, that is a personal preference. Later in the process, we're going to make it the leaf a little bit darker and add some contrast so that we won't have to, keep hiding them. But for now, I think it's really nice to be able to focus on just one or the other. So yeah, same thing here. You just want to kind of blend in the weird digital looking edges within the shapes without blending in the edges of everything. So you're going to do that on the flower base, the flower yellow layer, and the flower blue layer as well. So take all the time you need here. I'm going to stop talking to let you focus, and then we're going to meet up for the next step. Great, so once you're happy with your blending and everything starts looking a little bit more watercolor, but not quite yet, we still have a few things to do and a few techniques that I want to show you, you can go ahead and hide your sketch. And we're going to kind of clean up the shapes a little bit, so you can use the eraser tool and go over all of your layers to, for example, kind of tweak the points. So with the watercolor brushes, you get fairly round ends. So it is nice sometimes to just go back in with the eraser and make the point pointier. I personally try to not erase too much of the edges because, for example, especially the dark edges watercolor brush, like the name says, does have darker edges, which really helps with this watercolor vibe. So you don't want to go over and erase all of the edges, otherwise you're going to lose that. But you definitely can go in and kind of clean up your shapes a little bit. So going on all the different layers that you have and just cleaning them up as much as needed. And once you're happy, go ahead and select your flower yellow layer as well as the selection tool, set it to freehand, and make sure that the color fill option is deactivated. You're then going to create a wobbly selection towards the top of your flower, and you're going to feather this selection somewhere around 20%. It doesn't need to be exactly 20, don't worry about that. And then you're going to go in the adjustment panel here at the top, select hue, saturation, and brightness for the entire layer. And you're then going to be able to, well, change the hue, saturation, and brightness. What a surprise. So the hue, you're going to want to shift it a little bit towards the left to make your yellow a little bit more orange. And then you can kind of play with the saturation and the brightness until you get something that you like. But basically, we're going to create this kind of watercolor gradient feel in our flower. And we're going to repeat this technique with the bottom part of the flower this time. So creating just sort of a oval towards the bottom, feathering the selection again around 20%, and going back in hue, saturation, and brightness for the entire layer. And this time we're going to make this a little bit brighter, almost kind of a whitish gray color. So lifting up the brightness, lowering the saturation, and not touching the hue until we get something kind of like a creamy color in the base. Great, so we're going to use this technique a bunch more time on all the separate little layers that we have to really amp up both the watercolor feel and also kind of the bird of paradise feel to this. So going on your flower blue layer, you're going to again do a selection, feather the selection on the top part of your, I don't know, they're definitely not petals, but the top part of the flower again, basically. And you're going to shift the hue again towards the left. This time it's going to make it a little bit more teal. You might want to up the saturation, up the brightness a little bit as well, but feel free to experiment here. And we're going to do this technique a bunch of time on the flower base to create kind of this rainbow feel. So again, selecting the selection tool, set it to freehand. You're going to select pretty much the entire base of your flower base layer, something like that. And you're going to feather the selection again around 20%, going back to hue, saturation, and brightness for the entire layer. This time you're going to shift the hue towards the right quite a lot until you get a really nice teal color instead of green, and you don't need to shift the saturation or anything. You're going to create another selection slightly more towards the right this time, again feathering it and going back, you know the drill, shifting the hue again towards the right until you get more of a bluish, almost purple kind of color. You might want to lower the saturation here because it might get a little bit more electric that we might want, but yeah. And you guessed it, we're going to create another selection, this time a little bit more towards the right. So we select less and less of the base shape, but we keep feathering it around 20% and shifting the hue towards the right, which is effectively going to create a rainbow gradient at the end. So here we want more of a purple color. And finally, we're going to create selection pretty much just on the bottom part, so kind of the stem of the base. And this one you might want to feather it a little bit less than 20%, so around, 15, 16. And you're going to shift the hue so that this time you get kind of a pinkish, coralish color, and you might up the saturation, lower the saturation. You can experiment with that. And we kind of changed the color of this leafy little part here, which is not necessarily what we want. So we're going to select it again, not feathering it this time because we want to make sure that it is a crisp selection, and just bring it back to green. So you're going to have to play with the hue here and find what brings you to a green that you like, and maybe play with the brightness and saturation as well. But basically you just want to, select this little leaf and bring it back to green. You might also want to add a little bit more brightness on the very top part of your flower base, so just creating a selection, on the top, and it can span over multiple colors of your rainbow. That's totally fine. And this time you want to mostly bring up the brightness quite a lot and maybe shift the hue towards the left a little bit to make it more yellow, so make it feel like there's some sun hitting your flower. And we're going to use this technique to add a little bit more color variation on the leaf as well. So this time you want to make sure that both your flower and your leaves are activated so that we can see both at the same time. And we're going to create a selection towards the bottom part of the leaf where the flower kind of overlaps. And we're going to feather the selection, quite a lot this time. So at least 20%, it could go up to, 25. And this time we're going to lower the brightness so that we really get a little bit more contrast between the flower and the leaf. And you can maybe shift the hue towards the right to make it a little bit more blue. And you're going to create another selection, again, a wobbly selection, this time towards the top of your leaf, feathering it around 20% again. And this selection, you're going to lift out the brightness to pretend that there is light hitting your leaf. And you can maybe up the saturation and move the hue slightly towards the left. And there's one little extra step that we can do here to make it feel even more like watercolor before going in and adding the details to kind of make everything come together really nicely. So that little extra step is creating splatters. So for splatters, just create a layer above the leaf and flower group, rename it to splatters, and we're going to change the blending mode of this layer to linear burn to kind of have these splatters blend in a little bit better with the other colors, and you might want to lower the opacity around 50%, but we can always tweak it later. So in terms of free brushes, there are not that many great options in Procreate. If you go in the spray paints panel, you're going to see that there's a splatter brush, but it doesn't really look super good. And then there's this Giclée brush, which does look like splatter, but it's quite, quite dense. So you can use, an experiment with that. Otherwise, you can use the hard brush and kind of just drop some circles yourself and create some splatters that way. But if you have the watercolor brushes, you can obviously use the splatter brush that come with it. And yeah, just kind of add some splatters over your shape. I personally go in with a green color, so just kind of splattering green all over my piece. And then we're going to use the same selection technique to change the color of some of these splatters. So yeah, just using the selection tool and selecting kind of the splatters that are towards the flower, something like that, feathering the selection again, this time quite a lot, around 30%. And we're going to shift the saturation so that we can get some splatters that are not green. So you can experiment here. There's really no, perfect numbers for the hue, saturation, brightness here. You're probably going to want to up the saturation to the max, but other than that, experiment and get something that you personally like the look of in your piece. Okay, so let's make this whole piece look good, shall we? And we're gonna start by adding kind of the little lines on the leaf, I guess. So go ahead and select your leaf layer, and you can go back to either the dark edges watercolor brush or the hard brush in the airbrushing panel if you don't have the watercolor brushes. So basically here we're going to just add some lines on the leaf, and then we're going to blend them in. And for that, you're going to color pick a dark green from your leaf. I personally went ahead and picked too dark of a color. I'm not really a fan of how dark the lines are going to come out late in the process, so I recommend you pick a lighter green than what I have. And the X code that is going to be in the, that is in the corner of this video is going to be kind of adjusted for that. It is going to be a lighter green than what I used, so you don't need to, if you're using that color, you don't need to make it even lighter than what it is right now. And basically all we're doing here is we're just going to add the lines on the leaf. So yeah, just kind of slightly diagonal lines pointing upwards. And if you have a leaf that is flat, don't forget to draw the middle line as well. And if it is folded but we can still kind of see it a little bit, don't forget to draw it. And yeah, then we're going to go back to either the smudge tool set to the soft brush, again from the airbrushing panel, or the water blender set to your paintbrush. And we're just going to blend one side of this little line. So the left edge, we want to keep it crisp, and then the right edge, we do want to blend it. So we're basically kind of creating a gradient with the right edge. So you're just going to go over all of your little lines like this and blend them in so that the right edge is super soft and doesn't look like an edge at all, and so that the left edge stays really nice and crisp. And don't worry too much if you do kind of blend and have your line kind of bleed in the rest of the paper, so kind of outside of the color and the shape. We later are going to come in with the eraser to clean everything. So once again, feel free to take all the time you need. I'm going to stop talking and let you focus. You can also pause the video if you want, and we're going to meet at the next step, in which we're going to draw some really sharp details all over your piece to really make it look super, super good. Great, so when you're done with your blending, like I was mentioning earlier, you can just go back in with your eraser and clean up the edges where there's something, that doesn't look quite right. And there's nothing fancy here, just, clean up your shape and yeah. And once you're done cleaning up your leaf, we're going to create a new layer above everything, well, below the splatters, but above the leaf and flower layer. And this layer is going to be for the famous details that I was telling you about. So these details are really going to help kind of polish your piece, because right now it looks interesting, but it looks a little bit messy. And this detail layer, I personally like to lower the opacity. For now, I'm putting it around 45%, not 45 layers, that doesn't make sense. But we're going to tweak that later. And for the brush, I recommend you use a brush that has some grit to it, so either the 6B pencil or the HB pencil in the sketching panel, or if you have the watercolor brushes, go ahead and pick the coloring pencil. And with a fairly dark green, you're just going to be able to go over and kind of outline and crisp up some of the edges of first your leaf, and then later we're going to go in with the flower as well. And you can see I'm already changing the opacity of my details layer, so feel free to do the same, you know, experiment and see what works well with your illustration based on the colors that you have. And here, personally, what I like to do is go in with a bunch of lines kind of resembling, you know, lines that you would do in a sketch. So not really straight, soft, smooth. So not really smooth outlines, more like sketching lines. Just to add, that kind of crispness. It's not about adding outlines, it's really just more about, you know, defining your little shapes a little bit more. So I personally like to go over the different edges of the leaf, and then I like to also kind of go in and define the little sections of the veins. So just kind of these little lines here, kind of reinforcing them, especially when they are in the shadow, so kind of in the fold of the leaf. And you can also use this detail layer to go in and kind of sketch some, I guess, diagonal lines and cross hatches to add a little bit more texture and dimension and shading in some parts of your illustration. So really, this step is all about experimenting and getting your piece to look crisp and nice and professional. So this might take a little bit of time, but seriously, it is so worth it. This is what's going to make the difference between, you know, kind of a basic illustration and one that looks really nice and looks professional and, you know, finished. So we're going to do the same thing still in the details layer, but this time around the yellow petals. So you might want to color pick more of a yellow and make it darker for this, as opposed to going in with your green. And here you might also want to go in and kind of add some texture on the petals themselves. So kind of some little lines that go from the bottom of the petal towards the top point. Again, this is optional, feel free to experiment and do whatever you want. But I find that this really adds just so much detail and makes the piece feel so much more interesting and just more finished in general. And you know, it doesn't take that much longer, but it definitely does make a big difference. So once more, I'm gonna speed up the video, stop talking, and let you do it on your own. Feel free to pause the video to take as much time as you want, and then we're gonna come back and kind of do the same technique, but on the blue parts of the flower. Great, so no big surprise here. Once you're done with the yellow, we're gonna go on with the blue. So just color picking your blue, making it darker, and on the same details layer, just going in and kind of crisping up your shape a little bit. So creating some partial outline and maybe some shading with, you know, really loose little sketch lines. And for this blue parts of the flower, you can also kind of add this shape right here, as well as kind of a hole in the back. I'm not exactly sure how to describe it with words, honestly, so make sure you look at the video. But this is some part of the flower that you can draw if you want to be, you know, a bit more precise in the botanical accuracy of your Strelitzia. So once more, take all the time you need to create the blue details on the blue parts of the flower, and then we're going to move on to the base. And for the base, I have a few little special tips that I want to give you, so make sure you stick around until the end for that. So once you're ready to draw the base, just color pick kind of the tealish part of it, make your color darker again, just so that we can see the outlines. And just, I mean, like everything else, go ahead and kind of outline the base of the flower. Make sure that your color is quite a bit darker than the rest this time. And then just go in and kind of sharpen everything. And it is going to look a little bit strange right now because we have so many different colors on the space and we're just going to outline them all with one color. But for now, don't worry about that. I'm going to give you a tip, like I was saying in the end of the video, to really make sure that your edges and details look good no matter what color they are over in this space flower part. And once you have enough details, just go over the hue, saturation, and brightness tool again, but this time select the pencil option, and you don't need any selection for that. You just, go ahead and use this tool. And you're gonna shift your hue for now towards the far left, and you're gonna lower your brightness quite a lot because basically at this point we just wanna make sure that we see what we're painting. Because this tool is allowing you to use the hue, saturation, and brightness only on a certain area that you choose by painting over it. So once you're done selecting your area, you can just play with hue, saturation, brightness until you get your details to be a color that you like in that region, and you can repeat it on different parts of your flower if needed be. And if you enjoyed this video, I highly recommend you check this playlist in which I'm going to teach you how to draw a bunch of other watercolor houseplants. But before that, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos, and then go ahead and click on the link right here, and I'll meet you there.